What is that?
It's an adoption story from
Selected! That's cool.
You remember in The Matrix when Morpheus is like, do you want to take the blue pill or do you want to take the red pill? And then Neo says, I want to take the red pill because he wants to see how far down the rabbit hole goes. Well, this story is a little bit like the red pill. So don't listen to it if you don't want to go down the rabbit hole. It's a bit alarming to me. I've been thinking about it a lot ever since I've heard about it. It's an amazing story, but even bigger issue than I even realized that was out there. And what we're talking about today is frozen embryo adoption. So remember when Neo wakes up and it turns out he's in a pod and he looks around and he's just sees thousands upon thousands of pods all around him, each one containing a human life in it. This is a little bit about what it looks like to think about frozen embryos suspended in clumps of 120 cells in these columns suspended at negative 196 degrees Celsius, frozen in time. And so this story is about those frozen embryos, and it's about one of those frozen embryos that happened to find a warm heart.
Okay. I'm Jennifer.
This is Ben. We have 3 kids. Jocelyn, who's 9, Cooper, who's 8, and Sonora, who is 4.
Our oldest daughter is 9 years old, and we adopted her through standard domestic newborn. And then 9 months later, we were quite surprised to find out we were expecting our son. And he was born, our first 2 were 18 months apart. And then at that point, we decided to wait a while before we adopted again, but adoption had always been in our plan. And so when our son was about 3, we started a journey on adoption and ended up on kind of accidentally on a journey through embryo adoption.
The embryo adoption story for both of us really started before we adopted our oldest, Jocelyn. When we were looking at the adoption process, Jennifer came across embryo adoption as a topic really early on. And I don't know if she remembers, but we had a relatively serious conversation about it. And my interest was piqued. I was curious about it and open to it at that time, but I could see that Jennifer really wasn't there yet. And so being the good husband that I was, I laid off the topic and planned to revisit it with her later, and that really took 5 years before we came back to it. And Dana, a friend of ours, took care of bringing that topic back up for me and brought it up to Jennifer. And she really asked Jennifer to do some research. And Dana's the type of person that when she gets involved in your life, it usually ends in some pretty big life changes for your family. And when Dana asked Jen to do research on embryo, I see that now as Dana's not so subtle nudge for us to look at embryo adoption.
So just to kind of tell a little bit about how that all worked out, I was in the stage of life where I had 2 little ones, and so every day we read lots of books and played outside, and they had a nap, and that was the time of day when I had a little bit of downtime. And during that time, Dana called, who we had already connected with because of our first adoption through Sacred Selections. She called and she said, listen, I want you to research embryo adoption for me. It's something that I've been interested in for a long time, but I don't have time to do all of the research. And she knew that I had an English degree and that was something that I could manage. And I had time because we had nap time. So I'll admit Dana is a big picture person and I am a little picture person. And this was one more of Dana's big picture, wild haired ideas. And so I was, as usual, her skeptic, but I said I would be happy to do that. And I started digging. So I would put the babies to bed and I would start researching and reading. And day after day, I just felt like the story of frozen embryos and discarded embryos and scientific research on embryos got deeper and darker. And I felt overwhelmed, and I felt like the darkness of it all was just kind of creeping in at the edges of my mind all day as I went about my tasks. And thankfully, I have an amazing husband, and he would come home at night, and I would just throw it all out there and catch him up on what I was learning. And I was praying, too, praying things would improve, that it would be better, that we could find a way as Christians to just to find a way to be involved, to find a way to help the situation. The burden on those of us who believe that life begins at conception is a heavy one. And so thinking about those embryos, about fertilized eggs who have already begun to replicate, duplicate, the cells are growing, and then they're frozen, and then just thousands upon thousands of those sitting in facilities across this country and other countries. It made us want to get the word out. It made us want for other people to know that this is happening, that there are children who really do not have parents who can protect them.
Jennifer was great at the research, and the approach she took, since I had already been thinking about it for several years, I was probably mentally a little bit ahead of Jennifer. But as she was doing the research, she would constantly be bringing me her findings, and through that process, I learned a lot more things like there are thousands of embryos frozen out there, and so you start thinking about, you almost have these frozen orphanages out here across the United States, or really across the world, and you really start grasping the magnitude of what's out there.
So, those children, those embryos come about in that space for various reasons. Sometimes because their parents who have created them through IVF are planning to come back, and they're planning to let the babies grow inside of them, give them a chance. And so they're waiting for them. Sometimes because the parents haven't decided yet what to do. Should we donate them so that someone can adopt them? Should we donate them to science? Should we destroy them? So they're sitting there while parents are struggling to make those decisions. Sometimes it is because they have been created for this very purpose. And I think that was some of the darkest for me whenever I found out there were companies that were literally getting donations from people. They would pay people to their gametes so that they could create embryos, and then they would create them in these lab settings and pop them in the freezer, and then anyone who wanted to have a child in that way could do that much more easily and quickly. But they really were creating children without parents, without history, without any biological connection. just for the sake of convenience. So the longer that went on, the more difficult it became to consume, and that embryo adoption is a way to help in this situation. It's not, there are many ways to adopt, there are many ways to help people, but the embryo adoption is a way. And so, of course, I had, all of these struggles and worries and concerns, and my husband was just kind of like, everything's going to be fine. You really, everything's going to be fine. You don't need to be worried about this. And I was praying, and we were both praying all the time for direction and guidance and help. And finally, one day, I just said, somebody has to do embryo adoption just to get the word out so that other Christians will know about it. Somebody has to do this. And he just sat on the couch. I can see his face, and smiled and nodded. Did not speak one word. And I said, I didn't mean me. I just mean somebody. But in that moment, he knew and I knew that this was the path that we were probably on. I will admit that that is not the path that I really wanted to go on. I had been through a pregnancy and I was sick, terribly, terribly sick for a very long time. And I was afraid to do that again and go through that. But I was able to carry a child, and we knew that was a safe place for a baby to grow. So there was a lot of debate, a lot of struggle, always on my end, because my husband always felt confident.
As Jennifer continued to research, we learned things like the government views embryos as property, and so with that comes the laws that govern property, govern embryos. And so how would we take that? How do we deal with that? Different agencies handle that in different ways. We spent a lot of time looking at agencies that facilitate embryo adoptions. We really wanted an agency that viewed embryos as kids, like we did, viewed them as life and was careful with them in life. After the research, we landed on an agency called NEDC, which is National Embryo Donation Center.
The NEDC is highly recommended, and I wanted to let Dana jump in here for a second so that she can give us a little bit more specifics and a little bit more details that might be useful for you, the listener.
Dr. Keenan is in charge of it, and Dr. Keenan saw through his work through embryo donations, through infertility, he understood what was going on and how there were all of these excess embryos. And he decided to start this. And he goes out and he goes to fertility clinics and he says, do you have any of your patients who have excess embryos that they would like to donate to be adopted? And that's his plight. He wants to help the children come to term. And I'm so honored that a man of science can blend that with his Christian ethic to understand that this is truly God's children out there, and he's trying to save them. Just as much as Sacred Selections is trying to save children of all countries around the world, we say now we've helped 285 children from 9 countries around the world, and now the freezer. So these are the children that need our help. But I want to give a warning to those listening that there are clinics that will tell you that you can come in and you can purchase a frozen embryo. I would run, not walk away from places like that, because some of those places are just as evil as can be, because they're actually making those embryos, oftentimes with their staff, just so they can sell them. And yeah, about the ick factor, 1,000,000% on that. But this is wrong, and that's not what we want to support. We're trying to save the babies that came as part of a situation with a couple who, and I think Jen talked about it in her talk about as they went on, you find that a lot of these babies are excess embryos because one or both of the parents have died, or there's been a situation where, and that's even in the news right now, where people are fighting over who owns the embryos, and one doesn't want them to come to term and the other one does. There's an actress on TV that is fighting her ex. I don't even think they were married, but they created 3 or 4 embryos, and he wants to bring them to term, and she doesn't want them brought to term, which is very interesting and horrible and awful all at the same time. But this is what happens when you start, mixing and becoming outside of the realm of nature. But I say all that to say that please be careful. If you are interested in embryo adoption, look into the NEDC. They're highly accredited, and there are other accredited places. So look to see that you're working with a embryo donation center that is not just making the embryos, but that these truly are embryos that need help because maybe they don't have a mother or father, or there's a custody battle, and this is the only way for them to come to term.
They did exactly what we're looking for. They viewed these as children and caring for them as children. They were careful with them as children, but they also viewed it as adoption, that this wasn't a transfer of property. And so everything that you would have to go through for a traditional adoption, we also went through for an embryo adoption. So things like we had to do home studies. We looked at profiles of the families, the biological parents of the embryos, and we're making decisions accordingly. So really, after all this research, at some point you have to make a decision. And Jennifer and I have adopted a family motto called "Do Hard Things." We read a book called "Do Hard Things" years ago, and we constantly push each other to look at things differently and be willing to make some hard decisions. And so when Jennifer got to the place where she was ready, she came to me, and we really didn't have a conversation about where I was at, but unveiled at that point that I was really 99% of the way there. And I have this tendency to sometimes that 1% is the hardest to overcome. And so to get me to where I was ready to pull the trigger, I needed to close that gap. I have a good friend who is fantastic at allowing me to kind of dump on him and just lay my concerns on him one last time to help me talk through everything. He's a good thought partner. He's very reasonable and logical. And so one night I stole hours of his time, and he let me rehash everything again. And after talking with him, working through things, everything from where am I good on where life begins, what do the scriptures say about adoption, that really helped me close the gap, and we're really both 100% in. And so then at that point, I felt like we're ready to move forward.
And Dana shares that she was not trying to lead me to this place, but I think from the beginning she thought, I'll just toss this in Jen's lap, and I bet this is where she's going to end up. So it was all part of her master plan, but she would not say that is true.
And I wanted to take the listeners all the way back to 1991. Maybe some of you weren't even born yet, but in the early 1990s is when IVF, or in vitro fertilization, as it was called then, came to the forefront. And as with any new medical procedure or drug or anything, it's pretty much like the Wild West when you're first starting out. And all the powers that be and the players in it really didn't understand what they were doing, and those that did understand didn't let on. But those listeners who don't know, my husband is the medical laboratory scientist, and we had started a chain of medical labs, like when your doctor says, go to the lab and get this test done. That's what we did. So we were doing a lot of the early testing for women when they were trying to become pregnant through the IVF process. And back in the day, they were harvesting, and that's the words they used, harvesting the eggs of women who wanted to get pregnant through this method with abandon. I know now it's not done as much, but it was not uncommon for them to harvest 20 to 30 to 40 eggs at a time. And their reasoning was, the science community was, well, while we're in there getting them, let's just get as many as we can. Well, they also were making a lot of babies that way, too. And once again, science reasoning in the beginning was, well, we don't know how many of them are going to take. We don't know how many are going to be viable. So we were watching the progression of our families that were doing that. And it's when you're starting the hormone level for when you're going to have eggs harvest is different than anything that we're talking about with embryo adoption. You're not going through those heavy hormones and all of that when you're harvesting eggs. So it was a roller coaster ride for these women, and I felt for them, and we got to know them quite well because they would come in sometimes almost daily for different levels to know when they could receive their babies. So I remember distinctly one family who they had gone through one round successful completion of their baby, brought that baby to term. The second one, completion, brought that baby to term, all healthy. We were rejoicing with them. And then the third one. And after the third one, they were struggling. And they thought, I don't think we want more than 3 babies. This is this one family. And she said to me, which I didn't know, she said, Dana, what do I do? I have 35 frozen babies right now. And I was horrified, and I didn't understand what she was telling me. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, all these babies that we've been bringing to term are all from this same vial that when they harvested my eggs and were fertilized. And now I know what they were doing, but I wasn't aware of what they were doing, even though they said they told me I was so high on the hormones that I wasn't understanding. All I wanted was baby, baby, baby. And I think that that's very common for women when they do go through the IVF cycles. They do. They are. And I understand that, and I sympathize, especially those going through IVF in the first early stages of it, because they so wanted a child, and I identify with that. And they didn't understand all that was entailed, and they certainly didn't understand that they would have these, what's known in the medical community as leftover embryos. And so I distinctly remember this one patient, and I even remember her name, who said to me, Dana, we've had our 3. We don't want any more, but what do I do with my 35 that are still frozen in one vial? And she said, I now know those are viable babies. Those are my children. What do I do? And she reached out her arms and fell in my arms, and we cried together, and I was just astounded. And I remembered, I talked nonstop for the next 2 weeks about that with my husband, David. And I said, well, what would you do? What would you do? And so I started talking with some of our doctors that we worked with that were doing this. And I said, is there a way for somebody else to bring these babies to term? And they were like, no, that's terrible. That's just bizarre. Who would even think of that? And of course, I said, but they're babies and we've got to help them. So we fast forward now to the 21st century, and now it is possible to adopt those babies. And as soon as I heard that it was viable to adopt, we had an emergency board meeting with Sacred Selection. So we said, Are we going to get behind this? Is this something that we will fund to help the families? And it was a unanimous amongst all the board. This is life. Yes, absolutely. So personally, I have been, and I rejoice with every one of now 10 of our families who have had adopted frozen embryos, because I feel like that has been on my heart for so many years now, for 28 years, that what do we do? And those babies are viable and they're here. And now a second part of all of this is that we're hearing from Christians who have frozen embryos, and they want to know if they can get connected with our Christian families. Would another Christian family adopt our embryo? And that has been really wonderful to work with those families. And we do have those successful adoptions of Christian to Christian. And it's really added another dimension to, your brother and sister in Christ. It's, the frozen orphanages out there, they throw around numbers that are just astounding. But the ones just here in the U.S. are supposedly 500,000 of those babies. I'd like to point out to our listeners about a book that was done by a friend of ours who's a Christian. He and his wife adopted a frozen embryo and had 3 biological, and then adopted this little girl. And he's written a book. His name is Nate, Nate Birt, Birt. And the name of the book is Frozen But Not Forgotten. And I think that title says so much of what it is we're trying to get across in this podcast, that these children are here. We may not know about them, but we can't forget about them. And I'll send you, or I'll give Jesse the link to how you can buy the book on Amazon.
Got it. I have added it to the show notes.
But it's a really good account of what happens in an embryo adoption. They're very candid about it. They're also candid about what people said to them along the way. And I would suggest to any of the listeners who wanted to know more about embryo adoption, and especially from a Christian perspective, who followed that path of adoption, to get in there and order that book and read it.
So we started our home study, and even through that process, I was hopeful that we would be able to adopt domestic newborn, or even an older child, and that I would not have to go through this process. I was worried about the conflict. I was worried about about people that would not approve of our decision, about the criticism that we would get because of it. And I really just didn't want to face the conflict. But again, Ben is you do what you do, and you do what's right, and you don't worry about the rest of it. So all along the way, he was there to remind me and convince me and help get me to where I needed to be, and that we were going down a path that was not selfish, and it was in the hopes of bringing light to a very dark situation. And I knew that he was with us. That didn't mean everything was going to be fine or turn out well, but it meant that we were not alone.
And this is from my vantage point, it all really becomes a blur to me. So I remember going to NADC for the initial visit. I remember having the home study and these big critical moments, but I'm guessing Jennifer has all the details that are just blurs to me. But one thing that really stands out is the rigorous schedule of the medicine that Jennifer had to take to prepare her body for the transfer of the embryo. So she had to get shots at a regular time every single day.
So after we decided to go with NEDC and we did our home study, they required us to make a trip to their location, which is in Knoxville, Tennessee. it's a short, easy medical visit, but they were making sure that my body was capable of sustaining a pregnancy, to ensure that they were putting the embryos in a safe place where they could actually grow if they were able to grow. So we made that trip, and then the doctor there set up a treatment plan for me with medication. Really, it's the medical side of it is really not complicated. I was worried about that, but it's not complicated. They have to prepare your body, so they completely control it. They shut down your cycle, so then they control everything that's happening with your body through medication. And I think I did a week or two of shots in the stomach, which were not painful. And then I think 3 days before the transfer, Ben started giving me shots in my hip. So all of that went smoothly, and Ben had been giving me these shots in my hip for a few days, but we didn't really understand the direction on the shots. And I know that seems baffling, but you're supposed to give them really, really slowly, like over the course of minutes, and that didn't make sense to us, and so we were doing them quickly. But then that just means that you have lots. The shot itself wasn't terribly painful, but the medicine would just cause all kinds of pain in that area. And so I was really just having a lot of pain. I was having trouble walking. I was kind of stumbling around. And so we were staying with some friends in Knoxville, and I got out of the bed, and I was so sore. I really could just barely walk. And I stumbled into my suitcase, and I ripped my toenail back and ripped part of my toe, and there was just blood. There was just blood everywhere, and it hurt so badly, and I couldn't even get to the bathroom quickly because I'm like stumbling along because everything hurt. And I just got to the bathroom and sat there and cried. And I remember thinking, what are we doing? This is crazy. The babies that they put in me are not going to live anyway. There are people that I love and respect, and they aren't supporting this choice. And we just need to quit. This is ridiculous. This isn't even who we are. This is some harebrained idea. I have no idea what we're doing here. I just wanted to go home where it was safe and warm, and where I could be with my kids who I had left, and where there wasn't so much confusion and a lack of certainty about my future. But it sticks in my mind so clearly. Ben was still asleep, and so I came out and opened up Facebook, and I had a message from a Christian. I had never met him. I think he's a Sacred Selections dad, but I'm not even 100% sure about that. I knew who he was. You know, we had some of the same friends, but he just spoke words of life that were so filling and so grounding, and they were all of the reminders that day that I needed. He said, I just heard about this, and I want you to know how much I appreciate what you're doing, and no matter what happens, even if the babies don't live, you have given them a chance, and when we give life a chance, we are honoring God, and God is pleased. And it was all the things that I knew, but in the course of time and the pain and the worry, I just lost sight of that day. So I have never forgotten what it means, what it can mean to someone to say the things to them that they know. Because in that moment, it felt like God was just speaking. And he was speaking through this person. And I know, like, when Ben woke up, I showed him, and he was super encouraged too. But Ben's a rock, and so he was always there. He'd always been there, and there was much encouragement all the way around. Anytime I pitched to Dana all of the what ifs, which were always the worst possible case scenarios, she always came back with the what ifs, best case scenarios. And she was always there with the words to counteract. So we were not alone in this process, and we would not have gotten where we were if it had not been for the love and encouragement of so many.
One story sticks out that we'll probably tell forever is that so early on I was giving the shots to her every single day, and so we were setting alarms and timers to make sure that we didn't forget when they were happening. But as we got time went on, Jennifer got more and more comfortable doing it herself, and I still kept a close eye on it, tried to help her remember to do it, kept my reminders set. But one night, probably the first night that I wasn't there when she would have done the shots, I was going to see a movie with some friends, and so I knew that Jennifer had to take a shot. We talked about it before I went to the movie, but I'm sitting in the movie and my reminder comes on, and I'm like, I'm just going to shoot her a quick text, make sure that she remembers to do it. But I'm in the movie theater, and so I just sent her a text that says shots, and I think that's enough to jog her memory. But as typical communication, I intended it for one thing. She took it very differently, and she ended up thinking that I had been shot in the movie theater with a gun. And so she's texting me, calling me, but I'm watching a movie, so I'm not answering my phone or paying attention to anything, not concerned about a thing. And she ends up calling 911, and they send an officer to the movie theater, confirm there wasn't a shooting, tell my wife that she's missed something, she misunderstood anything, what had happened, and we actually didn't fully resolve the disconnect till I got home, and I realized that she had mistook it, and we're here. I'm just sending a gentle reminder, and she thinks I'm dying in a movie theater. And so I think that's a story with the preparation for embryo adoption that will carry forward with us. But
it really wasn't a big deal. I would have to have blood work done every couple of weeks just to make sure my body was responding to the medication like they wanted it to make sure everything was just right when we went for the transfer. And then once we got home, they started sending us profiles. So these are information about the biological parents, which inform you about the embryos. So things like race of the children, the age of the embryos, the health of the biological parents, maybe the reason for choosing adoption. And I will admit it was hard looking through those, primarily because we weren't interested in choosing children based on how attractive we thought they might be, or how smart, according to someone's standard, we thought they might be, or how educated their biological parents are. We also weren't interested in choosing embryos based on how healthy they might or might not be, or what psychological problems they might or might not have. So all of that was complicated. I think the most difficult piece of that was that not everyone wants embryos. I would say my guess is that a vast majority of people who choose embryo donation choose it because they value life. So they've done IVF, and they have the number of children that they want, and there are leftover embryos, but they're not comfortable with destroying them, and so they take away, which allows them to donate. So that is, I think, probably the vast majority. But we saw situations where there was divorce. We saw situations where there was a death of a spouse, cancer, physical problems that prevented the biological mother from carrying the embryos. And so these situations that we read about, it's a special kind of heartbreak. It is not what you would want for those families. And yet it is an honor and a blessing to be able to be a parent. I'm super thankful for those parents who have chosen life or the opportunity for life for their children, even when it was difficult, because often I think in those moments of choice, the easiest thing in that moment would be to destroy them, knowing that you didn't want to be a biological parent. That wasn't how you set out on this journey. That's not what you were looking for. And so and what I mean by that is you hadn't planned on having your children be adopted by someone. And I think that's hard. But these are parents who have made the difficult choice to put the life of their child before their feelings in that moment. And I think we have to honor and respect and appreciate that, because that is a moment of parenting sacrifice. And they have chosen to parent in that moment. Eventually, we made our decision primarily because we wanted open adoption. That was very important to us to have a connection. So I was taking the medicine and preparing my body, and we were praying. And there was just a lot of doubt, and there was a lot of worry. And all of that came to a head the morning of the transfer.
When we get there, we had worked through the details of what that would look like and what we were willing to do, and we had talked ahead of time that we were willing to put 2 embryos in, that we studied the risk and tried to understand what was happening. And so we get there, and they had thought 2 embryos to transfer into Jennifer, thinking that obviously the potential for having twins. Well, we get there, and we're sitting in the waiting area, and they told us that 2 that they had thawed did not look promising. The thawing process can be very difficult and very hard on the embryos, and so they had thawed a 3rd. And we obviously only had Sonora, our 3rd child, and so we lost 2 of them. And I believe that the 3rd one that they ended up thawing was in fact Sonora.
But when we got there that day, the embryologist came out and said, I thawed the first 2, and one of them is still alive, but it's going to die. But NEDC, if it's alive at all, they put it in. They don't let it die on the counter. And so it's going to die. The second one is okay, but I went ahead and thawed the 3rd one, and it looks really good. And so we weren't actually thrilled that she thawed the 3rd one because we weren't comfortable with refreezing, and it's just not the choice that we would have made. We would have just put the first 2 in. But I think it was providential, because I'm sure that Sonora is the 3rd one, because she's like, the 3rd one, like, basically she said the 3rd one is going to survive. And so because we weren't comfortable with the refreezing, we were like, just put them all in. So there were 3, but you can tell, like, I can tell in that moment, like, which one was going to survive. You can see, like, it's larger, it has more cells. I mean, it was already replicated. It had already replicated so much more than the other 2. But I mean, it was kind of a catch-22. I wanted them all to survive, but I was just like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do if we have 3 babies at the same time? And so I just prayed that they would all live and that we would manage to work it out and, not get divorced. So I don't think I was in the room with the doctor and nurse more than 10 minutes. And they gave me a picture. They gave me a picture of the embryos that they had put in. And I was able to watch on a screen whenever they put them in. I could see the bubbles where they went. They're so small that you can't even see the embryos, but I could see the bubbles from where they went. And then after that, it was 24 hours that they said just to take it easy, but I didn't have to do anything special. We went back to where we were staying and watched a movie, and I don't know, I think we went out for dinner. And then we were able to come home, And in 6 weeks, I had to have blood work done. Maybe 4 weeks. I actually can't remember how long it was, but a number of weeks. So we waited, and I remember so clearly that day. It was actually my son's birthday. And so we went and got the blood work done, and then took the kids and we got some hot chocolate, and then we just waited that whole day to find out if the babies had lived. And I felt really crummy, and I was like, oh, I know that those babies died. And we had spent so much time praying that God would help them to latch on inside of me, and he would allow them to grow, and that they would get to live, that they would get a chance. But they called that night and said, congratulations, you are pregnant. At least one of the babies has lived. So when Ben got home from work, there was much rejoicing, and there were tears and laughing and hugging. And at the end of the day, there was pizza, because at the end of every good day for Ben, there was pizza. So pregnancy was unremarkable. We had to have a few extra ultrasounds, because they just have extra ultrasounds when you do embryo adoption. And I remember at 9 weeks, we did an ultrasound at 6 weeks, and we saw that there was only one baby. And then an ultrasound at 9 weeks, and I saw her moving her little arm. And I thought, look, this baby is going to live. We're really going to have a baby. She's going to live, because she was a baby when she was in a freezer. She was a baby when they put her inside of me. But all along, you don't know with any pregnancy how it's going to turn out. And I was just amazed that so early we could see so much movement. And what a thing it was to be able to be in that room and to see what was happening inside of me, and to know that my child was able to move her arms. And so, yeah, unremarkable, except for there was just so much sickness. But we made it through. And on August 15th, she was born, with jet black hair that stuck straight up, and with fat rolls already. And we were just so thankful. And we welcomed her home, and the other two kids were overjoyed, like any kids would be. And really, we think very little about, except for the fact that we're connected with her biological family and that we talk about them. We think very little about adoption day in and day out. This is our family. This is who we are. The different biological roots matter a whole lot to us, and that's why we have these family connections. We want to maintain those relationships, and those people matter to us. We love those people. We love their our children's biological families. But day in and day out, these amazing things that God has given us are just the amazing blessings of our wonderful, beautiful children.
In probably a man way, in a cold way, describe embryo adoption to people that I come across as someone else made Sonora, our daughter, froze her. We came and adopted and then put her in my wife. And so my wife gave birth to a baby that has no genetic makeup of either one of us. And so that's kind of an interesting way of coming about adoption. Some interesting stories that come with it. So my wife got pregnant. I wasn't even in the room with her. Sonora, because she was frozen for so long, she was actually older than my oldest daughter. So she was conceived before my oldest daughter. She was frozen for roughly around 7 years. And so it creates an interesting dynamic when you think through some of the implications about that. But as we talk to people, as we share our thought process on this, I think there's some helpful things to think through, that if people believe that life begins, then we need to be involved in preserving life. And you think about earlier when I made the comment about if there are frozen orphanages, these children do not have a voice. Jennifer and I talk a lot about how adoption is not for everyone, and embryo adoption is not for everyone. I've heard the analogy before that there's an ocean of there's children drowning in an ocean, and they need saving, and not everyone can swim, and some people go out and swim and try to rescue the children, and others go and get boats and try to rescue children. Some are standing on the shore, but there's helpless children out there that need our help, and we have an opportunity to be a voice for the helpless, and feel like there's an obligation for us to do that.
Occasionally I feel overwhelmed by the fact that if just a few things had shifted, she might have been donated to science, or she might have been destroyed. Or maybe we would have chosen different embryos and she would still be in the freezer with thousands of other kids who have bright eyes and a contagious laugh and give tight neck hugs and pray to God before dinner. Biggest criticism, or sometimes it's just a question, there's no baggage, it's just a question, is that it doesn't make sense that we would promote helping children who aren't suffering, because the embryos are in a freezer, and so they're not being mistreated, they're not hungry, they're not in pain. So shouldn't we be helping children in orphanages instead of helping suffering? And my response to that is always the same. I would never, ever discourage anyone from helping any child in any difficult situation, wherever they are and however that looks. And from helping families that are in distress to helping single mothers so that they can keep their children and families can be preserved, to foster care, to safe families, to traditional adoption, to international adoption, to older child adoption, to embryo adoption, that what we are doing is finding people or children who need help and helping them. And I say that in a struggling to find exactly the right words. My child needed a warm place to grow, and I could offer that to her, but I also wasn't trying to save her in a so great, and I'm going to come in and rescue the world sort of way. Just that I have something to offer you. We have something to offer you, and you have something to offer us too, because we are a family, and families have give and take and love and respect for one another. And so when we welcomed those embryos into my body, we just said, you're our family now. It wasn't about a savior complex. It wasn't about us being wonderful, amazing people. It was about having something to offer, having something to share, and wanting to share that. And that is true of all parenting, that parents have something to share. They have their love to give. They have sacrifices that they can make in adoptive parenting, embryo adoptive parenting, fostering, and helping others so that families can be preserved. So I would never suggest that someone choose embryo adoption over a different type of adoption, or over helping preserve families, or over foster care. I just would say this is a way that you can show that life matters. I would also, one of the other responses that I give is that if you believe that life begins at conception, then I do, then if you believe that children are created in the image of God, then destroying embryos is no different from the morning after pill. It is no different from abortion at 6, 12, 18, 24, or partial birth. It is all the same. Human life is human life, and it ought to be protected and preserved. And so because of that, it was important for us to offer what we could offer, and also to help others know that this is an opportunity, that this is a way. And if you are considering doing IVF, then maybe consider embryo adoption instead, because these children are already here, they're waiting, and they need you.
Hey, do you remember that part in The Matrix when you were watching the third Matrix movie that came out, and then you realized that the movies had gotten really dumb?